So James and John were awfully bold in today's reading. I think everybody can pretty much agree on that. I really can't I can't hardly imagine walking up to anybody and saying, I'd like you to do whatever I want, and I'm not going to tell you what that is. Full stop, no explanation, no context. Just, I have something I'd like you to do, and after you agree to it, then we'll talk about what that might be. Nobody does that. It isn't something I'd ask anybody, much less Jesus. But James and John were more bold than I am, obviously. But Jesus is kind to them. And instead of going on a tangent about their rudeness and their boldness in this question, he simply goes deeper with them and asks, what are you getting at? What do you want? And of course, then we hear about how they want to sit at Jesus' right and left hand. And if we pause right there and we think about it, we can see something playing out in their lives that has almost certainly played out in our own lives at one point or another. Because they were acting out of what they perceived as a lack of available positions. In this case, prestige and power positions. It could have been money, it could have been relationships, it could have been time, but it was prestige and power, and they were acting out of a lack. There was only so much of it to go around because there were only 2 spots next to the throne, right? Right and a left. You picture it, it'd be harder to find any more room than that. Jesus had 2 ears for people to listen to, and that was it. It was the advisors that sat on the right and the left. Earthly Jesus had 2 ears. So there were 12 disciples and 2 places, and those are not great odds. It was a competition for scarce resources, scarce positions. And they had to make themselves known and familiar. They had to get their names in early so they would be known. Jesus needed to know that they did want those positions and that they were ready to take them. It might be a little bit more blatant in our story today than it is when we do it. But it's the same scenario that plays out as people scramble up that corporate ladder. It happens all the time. And Jesus as well. Yeah, I can't promise anything with that. That sounds like a good boss, right? I can't promise anything. We're going to have to think about that. That's not what Jesus says. Jesus says those are for the people who they've been set aside for. And then he says, now, here's what you'd be getting yourself into. You're going to have to drink from the cup that I drink out of. And remember, he's just predicted his death. So just right before this, he just predicted his death again. So you're going to have to drink out of the cup that I drink out of and be baptized into the baptism that I have. And they're like, yeah, we can do that. Jesus like, are you sure? Yeah, we're ready. We can do that. And Jesus says, okay. Yeah, you're right. You're going to do that. And I always imagine, and this is purely my imagination, but I always imagine that Jesus shakes his head and snickers a little bit right here. Text doesn't say that, but they don't get it. And then, if that wasn't enough of a story, the other 10 hear about this conversation, and they are understandably upset. Because James and John have preempted them. Like, they got there and asked the question first. But Jesus calls them together and brings them into a completely new understanding about the abundance in their lives and how being at Jesus' right and left hand is not about being in scarce positions of power and authority. It's a completely new understanding about what abundance means because they don't have to work from that sense of scarcity. They don't have to focus on what is lacking in their lives. He tells them that there is power in serving and being okay with wherever you are at, instead of scrambling for that one place of power, because there's plenty of God's power and plenty of God's love to go around for everybody. Now, if you think about this, to stay on the business theme, if you think about this from a business perspective, it's switching from what might our profit be if we go this direction to what is our acceptable loss? Which is a lot of times how people make decisions anyway. What is our acceptable loss in this situation? And so, how much are they willing to risk to be in service, to do the things that Jesus does? So, a friend of mine talks all the time about her aunt. Her aunt was one of those people that everybody just loves to tell stories about. Older woman, only had 8 years of education and worked her whole life serving other people in various jobs and at home. Her husband worked on the railroad tracks. They lived in this little tiny house that was right next to the railroad tracks their entire married life. And they really had very, very little. But more than once, when there was a kid in the neighborhood who needed a place to live, who needed a meal, who needed a backpack, whatever it was, her door was open. There was food on her stove, and there was an extra bed, and if somebody else was already in the extra bed, then there was a couch, and if there was somebody on the couch, there was floor space. And they never really had enough, but they always had enough. They always had enough for whoever and whatever came through their door. Because whatever it was, they decided that whatever they had to do it without, whether it was her having a meal that night, because there was a lot of nights that she went without supper because an extra kid came, or whether it was not sleeping well because you had all these extra people in your house, whether it was never getting to move out of the house, the little tiny house next to the railroad tracks, whatever it was, that was acceptable to her because she wanted so badly to be of service. And so that's one end of the spectrum. A lady with nothing who always had something to give. She's always of service. But when we think about it from the other end, we can think about Bishop Desmond Tutu, who could have easily just been a bishop in Johannesburg. But he didn't. He used that position and the power that he had to step out and confront apartheid. And he got death threats, and he got arrested, and he got kidnapped. And all of that was an acceptable loss to him. So it's not that you always have to start out with nothing and depend on God's going to provide, God's going to provide. Bishop Desmond Tutu had a lot. He had a lot of power. He had all the money he needed. He had a great place to live. He had a lot. He had a lot to lose. And yet all of that was an acceptable loss to him. All of it. Because he considered his position a position of service. And so he stepped out and he risked everything to be that person who would be to service of others, who would bring others God's love. And it makes us remember, what is our acceptable loss for Jesus? What would you be willing to lose to be first? To be first to see what Jesus is doing in the world. To be the person who's right there on the front line witnessing those miracles. What would you be willing to lose to be transformed as Jesus is transforming the world through you? Because if Jesus is transforming the world through you, you are going to experience new life too. and you're going to see it first. What are you willing to lose to have that peace which passes all understanding in your life? As you bring that to others, you'll find it too. Not that you won't find it without bringing it to others. Sometimes that goes the other way. All of this sometimes goes the other way. Sometimes you see the miracle, and then you go to the front lines. Sometimes you see the transformation, and then you want to be transformed. But a lot of times, it's because you've said, I want to be there, and I want to see what you're doing first, that you get to see it. That you get to see Jesus working, to have that peace in your faith, to be part of the transformation, and to see the kingdom of God breaking in. Aunt Esther certainly did that. And Bishop Desmond Tutu certainly did that from very different places in the world. So what is your acceptable loss? And then in this amazing twist of the tables Jesus is so good at, he gets us with it all the time, right? He basically asks them to accept the same question they started with. It's not written there, but he basically, when he asks them to serve, asks them to accept the same question they started with. And eventually it's the same thing that Jesus asks of all of us at one point or another, sometimes all the time. Will you do whatever I ask of you? Full stop. What is your acceptable loss to answer that question? Is any loss acceptable to you in order to know the love of Christ for yourself and to take that love and be that love in the world? But here's the promise. The promise makes this question different. Because we have the promise. We have the promise of the love that is so strong that not even death can separate us from that. There is nothing that can separate us from that love and from the life that that love gives. And so, even as all of us do at some point or another, because we're human, all of us will say, no, that's not an acceptable loss. I'm not going to do that right now. Jesus, go find somebody else. I'm sure there's somebody else out there who might want to do that. And we've all done that. Or if we say, I'm scared, that loss is too great, or I really want this power position, whatever it is, whatever our answer is. The thing is that you still have that love. And that's the amazing promise. You might not be on the front lines of the kingdom breaking in, but you will be loved. You will be cherished. You will be made new. You will be saved. All those things that we talk about all the time. And so as we grow into this, whatever we lose by serving, if we lose anything at all, because we don't always, will become more and more acceptable to us. Because the kingdom is God is so great, and we continue to see the abundance. And once we know the abundance is there, then it's easier and easier to lean into that abundance. To lean into that abundance for our power, for our value, for our identity, instead of leaning on what the world gives us. And so this week as we go out from this place with our tummies full of German food and all happy and joyful, maybe ponder that. Maybe there's something that Jesus has been calling you to do and you've been like, I'm not so sure about that. Or maybe it hasn't felt like anything has come up lately. And maybe you can ponder well, maybe I need to say, I'm ready to serve. Or maybe your life is going crazy right now, and you can be thankful for how Jesus came to serve us, how Jesus came to serve you by loving you and healing you and giving you new life. Because gratitude is powerful too. So this week, may you know that love of Jesus' service in your life. And may that be so real that you can't help but serving others. Amen.